Thanks for the intro, Rob, and thanks to everyone for joining in today and making time to listen to today's presentation. I'm going to turn my camera off just to save on bandwidth a little bit and turn it back on when we get into questions, but wanted to show my face and say hello to everyone first. Um, all right, well, let's get right into it here. Brief overview of what we're going to look at today. Going to talk about what MSIs are, the risk factors. Spent a good amount of time looking at the AMHSA data. Obviously, majority of our attendees are members of municipalities, and I think looking at the data will really speak to you. It will make sense. It will probably align with what you see in your own municipalities, whether they are smaller, medium, or larger in size. I don't think it would vary too much in terms of where we're seeing these incidents occur. So I'm going to take a bit of time to kind of walk through that. I'm going to look at how we can use JDAs or PDAs to potentially identify where force may be of concern. Going to talk a little bit about the hidden load, and then we'll get into some examples of evaluation tools. We're not going to get too in depth into evaluating force today. We just don't have time. But I think the plan in the fall is we'll have another session on force. We have one likely speaking to evaluating the risk associated with force, and then possibly another one on more focused on solutions. And at the end, we'll share some resources and answer any questions that you might have. So that's kind of what we're planning on for today. So those of you that have attended earlier sessions that we've put on talking about MSI prevention are going to be familiar with these primary risk factors. These are all risk factors that can contribute to the development of musculoskeletal injuries. Obviously, today our focus is on force, but we need to be aware that posture and repetition also are sort of primary risk factors. And other items such as contact stress, vibration, whether it's hand, arm, or whole body vibration, and then temperature extremes can also have their impact. In addition to the factors associated with what's being done, we all have different personal risk factors, and our stature and our strength are certainly items that will play into how much of an impact force is as a risk factor for us. And that'll make more sense as we get a little deeper into the presentation and I share some examples with you. When we look at a model for a couple different models for musculoskeletal injuries, biomechanical risk factors are sort of the item that we generally are most concerned with. So, how much force is involved, what posture am I in, how long am I doing it, all those things will factor into that. And then there are additional risk factors that can also not or make that worse. So when we talk about organizational risk factors, what I'm talking about there is more, how the work is designed, how long we're going to be doing it, how many people are available to do it, what kind of breaks we can get, those sorts of things. So how the job is designed has its impact, and then our personal risk factors. If we're particularly short or particularly tall, what kind of physical condition we're in, how much extra weight we're carrying. All these things are risk factors that will impact the development of musculoskeletal injuries as well. So I said, when we look at the biomechanical risk factors, the primary things that we are interested in is what posture we've adopted, how much force is required, and then the repetition and duration rate on that. And I mean, a simple example of that is if we ask you to lift, 20 pounds in a neutral posture once compared to 20 pounds in an awkward posture. If we add in an awkward posture to the weight, it becomes more difficult. If we ask you to do it 20 times instead of one time, all those things increase the likelihood of developing a musculoskeletal injury. So, and the relationship between those factors is fairly well understood, depending on how awkward the posture is, what the force is, and then the repetition and duration. So those are things that we can fairly easily sort out if we know the information. Last slide, just talking about kind of to get us thinking about the injury model, and then we'll get into more of the stats specific to AMHSA. And some of you will have seen this slide before from me if you've attended some of the other sessions. But you know, simplest way to think about this slide, the red line on the top is our tissue's capacity to do work. The blue line on the bottom is the amount of work that's been placed on that particular tissue. And essentially what you can see is as we're doing stuff, depending on how much effort is associated with that, our tissue's capacity is decreasing every time we do more intense work or harder work. And when we get to the point in the day there where we're lying down, we're having a sleep, that the demand on whatever tissue that happens to be in the body is at baseline or minimal, and that's when our body tissue gets the opportunity to recover. And basically, the idea here is if your tissue doesn't get enough time to recover, at a certain point, the blue line and the red line meet, and that's when we exceed our tissue's capacity and we have injury. And the other kind of take home from this slide is our tissue capacity changes over time, right? So if we're fully rested like we are on the left side of the page, we can do a lot more work than when we're tired and fatigued and we've placed a lot of strain on our body. And again, we can all think of examples of different times when people work longer, harder, or busier, whatever, where their tissue's capacity is going to decrease. Okay, so let's get into some of the AMHSA incident data, and this is all from 2022. As you can all appreciate, it takes a while for the data to come out, and then once you have some time to analyze the data, and it's always a little bit behind, even though we are in 2024. So it's kind of an overview of WCB data for AMHSA. Obviously, large number of employers covered, 370 different groups. We can see the number of claims there at the bottom, over 2,000 lost time claims and over 4,000 no lost time claims, and over 78 million in premiums paid. So, if you look at the AMHSA membership, it's a lot of organizations, lots of employees, sorry, that are covered by this, and what comes along with that is a large number of claims as well. If we look at a little closer at the leading injuries from 2022, some interesting things to highlight here. So, looking at nature of injuries, sprains and strains were the largest group, making up almost 40%. And sprains and strains are the type of injuries that myself as an ergonomist are most interested in and are the ones that we're most likely to be able to assist with. If we look at the most common events, it's body reaction. If we look at source of injury, the biggest group there is body motion or injured or ill worker. And if we look at the occupation with the largest number of injuries, it's public transportation operators. And any of you that have folks that are operating buses and shuttle buses and that sort of thing, that's not going to be a surprise to you. It's quite common, just given the nature of that work. Okay, so the next slide I want to look at is the 10 most common types of injuries. Okay, and this is by number of injuries. So again, top one here, sprains and strains. That makes sense. It's going to align with what we've talked about previously. And if you look at the number of claims that are sprains and strains versus the next most common which is mental health type injuries, sprains and strains are almost 3 times the next one, right? And then you can see it trails off from there. So sprains and strains are a very common type of injury. If we look at the top 10 injuries based on highest cost, sprains and strains also leads that that category. Now, the gap between the costs associated with sprains and strains and mental health claims is a lot smaller. Mental health claims are certainly a costly type of injury, and we can see that depicted in this slide. And really, and again, keeping in mind these stats are from 2022, so you still see things like COVID-19 being listed there. If you were able to eliminate sprains and strains and mental health issues, that would wipe off a ton of costs associated with the claims that we see in the AMHSA membership. All right, so the next slide I wanted to look at was looking at top 10 occupations with the highest number of claims. Okay, so if we look at these, firefighters and peace officers right at the top, very closely followed by public transportation operators. And then again, no surprise, public workers and maintenance workers, program leaders in rec and sport, heavy equipment operators, right? These are all things, these are all occupations that I know from my experiencing working with municipalities, none of this really is surprising. And I would assume for those of you that are involved in health and safety in municipalities, this would seem to make sense to you as well. If we keep going down the list, um, maintenance equipment operators, other trades, helpers and laborers, landscaping and grounds maintenance workers. So like our parks and rec folks, again, all people that are doing physically, likely physically demanding work. If we look at the top 5 events with the highest total cost of claims, we see bodily reaction, followed by exposure to traumatic events, fall on same level, overexertion, and highway accident, rounding out the top 5. So for me, bodily reaction and overexertion, those are very likely to be musculoskeletal injuries, right? So these are the ones that, again, myself as an ergonomist are most likely to have an impact on. If we look at data associated with bodily reaction. Again, as I had suggested in the previous slide, majority of those are sprains and strains, almost 80%. And you can see here the spread of injuries across different body parts. So bodily reaction, you want to think of a non-impact injury resulting from excessive physical effort. So it could be bending, climbing, reaching, standing, slipping or tripping without falling. All these things that, again, we might associate with adopting an awkward posture or trying to hold ourselves up, trying to stop ourselves from falling, things of that nature. Okay. If we look at risk factors, we can see here on the image on the left that force accounts for 40% of the AMHSA incident data. And this is really why we're here today, is we can see that force is the leading risk factor for the claims that we are seeing. And on the right there, we can see a breakdown of body parts affected by MSIs. No surprise, we see the lower back as being sort of the leading one, and then again, we're going to see injuries to many areas of the body. Kind of just a couple more slides on stats, and then we'll get into, okay, so what does all this mean? If we look at the top body parts affected by force as a risk factor, see the lower back is the highest, followed by the shoulder and the knee. Again, we tend to think when we hear force, we think of manual handling, we think of lifting. My hope in today's presentation is to get you thinking beyond just lifting. There's certainly many other tasks that we do that force has its impact as it relates to development of MSIs. And then if we look at top occupations in force risk factor for MSI claims, police officers being number 1, followed by firefighters, public transit, public workers, and heavy equipment operators. So again, it follows very similar to the other stats that we were looking at, but a number of areas that we will commonly see. Okay, last graphs, so we don't get graph fatigue here, and then we'll get into kind of a summary and get into what do we do about all this. So, um, top occupations category for force as a risk factor in MSI claims. Here we're seeing trades at the top, followed by police, fire, public transit, and equipment operators. Okay, and then top events in force as a risk factor for MSI development, bodily reaction being number one. And remember, I said that what we're talking about there is non-impact injury resulting from excessive physical effort. So bodily reaction, then overexertion. We're trying to do a little bit more than we're capable of. Bending, climbing, or crawling, and then overexertion lifting, which has been broken out from overexertion itself. Okay, so lots of graphs, lots of stats. How I would summarize that, or if I was trying to give you the highlights of that, first thing, sprains and strains are the most common injury for AMHSA, for the AMHSA membership. Sprains and strains are the most costly injury because cost always catches our attention. Bodily reaction is the top most costly type of event, right? So, and as we've implied there, or I've mentioned a couple of times, that's a non-impact injury resulting from excessive physical effort. Sprains and strains is the most common nature of injury from bodily reaction. And again, those are the types of things that, as an ergonomist, I'm looking to help present. And force represents 40%, 47% of the risk factor to all claims. So that's the highest percentage, which is why we want to talk about that specifically today. And last but not least, and certainly not surprisingly, the low back is the most commonly affected body part for MSIs. Okay, so if we know force is an issue, how do we look for it? What do we do to try and identify it and then ultimately eliminate it or reduce the risk associated with that? So the first thing, the easiest thing I would suggest you do, if you have JDAs or PDAs, so job demands analysis or physical demands analysis, you want to review those to look for areas of concern. And I've got a couple slides here. We'll go through where to look in those PDAs or JDAs. And like I said, those are a great starting point. Now, if you don't have those, and lots of organizations will not necessarily have those in place, hazard assessments can also be a good source of information. I always joke that when we identify manual handling as a concern, the control is always, use proper body mechanics. Well, if we're asking somebody to lift 300 pounds, proper body mechanics is not going to resolve that. But at the very least, it might tell us where we have some of those heavier items or where force is of concern. And then, if you don't want to comb through a bunch of hazard assessments or you're not seeing um, these types of items coming up in your hazard assessments, you can simply ask people, what are some activities where they feel there are higher forces or they have to exert greater effort to complete? And those are the things that we want to look at. And as I mentioned, it might not be just lifting something heavy. It could be the posture we need to hold for a period of time that makes something challenging. And we might not actually be holding anything. It might be just our body itself. And we'll explain why that's a concern here in a few slides. Okay, so if we are looking at JDAs or PDAs, and I've brought up WC Alberta's blank one that they will ask you to fill out if you're completing their format. And really, whether you use WCB's format or your company's got their own format, they're all going to have a very similar bits of information. So first page I've got up here is the manual handling section. You know, if we talk about what makes a lift more difficult, it's usually if it's a low level lift or if it's above shoulder level. So I would, start by looking at those. And then second thing I would look at is the frequency. So you can see here there is JDAs or PDAs will have a frequency rating. So something doesn't happen, it's rare. It's only happening 1 to 5%. It's occasional. It's happening 6 to 33%. It's frequent. It's a third to two-thirds of the time, and it's constant when it's happening two-thirds or more. So if you've got um, items that are happening more frequently, even if the weight that somebody's lifting is less, it could still be of concern. We get it in our mind that, oh, we got to be aware of things that are over 50 pounds. And as long as everything's under 50 pounds, it's not an issue. Well, if we have to lift it 100 times a day, or if it's above shoulder level, or if it's at ground level, it might not need to be that heavy to be of concern. So I would look at things that are more frequent, things that are in more awkward positions, and then obviously things that are heavier as well. If we go to the next page here, and this is talking about um, more positional, so what kind of body postures that we're in. Anytime we are bending forward or we've got trunk rotation, so we're twisting, the further we get out of a neutral posture, uh, even if we aren't lifting an object, we are still supporting the weight of our torso. So if we lean forward, we got our lower back is supporting the weight of our torso and our arms and anything else that we happen to be carrying. So whether we're carrying something or not, we're still supporting the weight of our body. So any of these more extreme postures, if they're flagged as occurring, and then if they're flagged as occurring more frequently, those are, again, areas of concern. And then here goes into examples of different weights. I've got the heavier items kind of flagged with a red arrow here, and then I've got items that are maybe a little lighter, flagged as orange. I would really be cautious about, if we see something as light and just not worrying about it at all, because depending on where the position is and how frequently is it still could be of concern. So weight alone is not a good um, evaluation of whether something has a risk that we should be concerned with. Okay. And then if we look at the different ratings here for weight, and these are standard use, this is what WCB references in all their documents. As I said, yes, items that are greater than 20 kilograms are rated as heavy. That's regardless of where they are. But you could have something that's in that light category that's 5 to 10 kilograms that, if it's in an awkward position or it's done frequently enough, could still be of concern. So we need to think about that. And that's where I said, weight alone is not necessarily the best evaluator. Um, and then here, looking at the frequencies, here kind of gives you an overview of how that works. Again, increased frequency, we want to pay greater attention to. If we go back to just kind of a side note, but definitely something worthwhile, when we create JDAs, and it would be the same if you're doing this internally, and if you listen to Annie's talk about this earlier in the year, one of the things we do is we observe, we take measurements, we interview, we come back with a draft document, and then we need to get sign off from the people that do the job and that manage the job that, what we've put together, or that what you've put together is a good representation of the job. It's amazing how many times we come back with an item that's 60 pounds, 70 pounds, whatever weight, and the employer will go, well, no, 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 they don't lift that. And I'm like, yeah, they do. Like we were there for the day, we saw them lift it 5 or 6 times, and it's, no, 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 they don't lift that. Like, yeah, we've got pictures of it, we weighed it, right? So it can be, and sometimes the organization will have a policy that people aren't supposed to lift it, and sometimes it's people aren't aware of the policy, or sometimes people just don't follow the policy. But if you've got people lifting something that's heavier, we want to make sure that we know that. And sometimes that leads to a change in the work procedure for that item, or that it's always a two-person lift or whatever. So it can be a really good in addition to providing lots of great information when you have JDAs, it can be a really good exercise in identifying and making sure that everyone understands what actually happens physically on a day-to-day basis. All right. So what I wanted to talk about next is force versus exertion, and we'll see some examples of this, and then we'll get into some specific examples of force of as concern for jobs that we see within the AMHSA membership. So, force is defined as the externally observable result, sorry, of a specific exertion, and exertion is the tension produced by muscles and transmitted through tendons to generate force. So the easiest way to think about this is if you're asked to lift a 10-pound box, the weight of the box doesn't change. It's 10 pounds, but how much exertion definitely varies depending on where it's located, how strong you are, what position you're in, all these different types of things. So um, the simplest example I can show you is on my next slide here, and there's all kinds of different examples about this. So I've mentioned the hidden load previously, and it's a really important thing to consider when we're talking about force as a concern. So the hidden load basically refers to the weight of the body when completing a task. So you can imagine, we look at the picture on the left, we're lifting a file box from the floor. If I go to pick that up, I've got to pick up the box, but I'm also lifting the weight of my torso because I'm leaning forward. If we look at the picture on the right, the box is already up at waist level, so I'm able to adopt a more upright posture. In that example, really all I'm lifting is the weight of the box. I'm not having to lift the weight of my body. And as a result, the picture on the left requires greater exertion than the picture on the right. Okay, so and that would be true whether I was lifting the box or not. If I'm bent over, like you see me in the picture on the left, my body's doing a lot more work to maintain that posture. For me standing upright on the right, it's a whole lot easier, right? So exertion makes a difference there. Now, that's based on my height. If I was shorter, bending over maybe is not as difficult. If I'm taller, it becomes even harder again, right? So there's different things that can impact the level of exertion. Um, so let's say picture on the right. Let's say I've got one more picture there and it's my twin. I don't have a twin, but let's pretend I do. And they are twice as strong as I am. So they've got more muscle strength. It's going to be less exertion for them to lift the box than it is for me. It's using less of their capacity. And I'm not saying that to suggest that we create industrial athletes and we need to make everyone stronger. It's just the reality. Some people have greater strength than others. So when they go to lift something, it's less of their capacity, it's less exertion. It's just different ways of thinking of force versus exertion. Um, but hopefully this gets you thinking that, just knowing how much the box weighs, so if the box is 10 pounds, whether it's on the floor or on the table makes a big difference, right? Whether I'm able to get up nice and close to it or I have to reach for it, that makes a big difference. And really, if you go back to our stats and looking at how many of those things were overexertion, we were doing more than we were capable of, or we're bodily reaction, we're into a funny posture, and we're getting more force placed on us. Those are a lot of the things that can cause us issues as it relates to force. Okay, so let's get into some examples here. So I've tried to identify some examples that are relevant to the audience here today. Obviously, we're primarily municipalities, and municipalities are all going to have very similar types of employees. Um, Carts and dollies are something that would be used not just in municipalities, but in lots of different places, uh, in office settings, and also in lots of different industrial settings, whether it's a shop where we're moving supplies, we're moving items within a warehouse, that sort of thing. And sometimes we think, oh, well, if we've got a cart or a dolly, that makes it easier. That should eliminate the risk of injury. It's not that simple, right? There are a number of things that will impact how well use of a cart is helpful, right? So how heavy is the object that I'm moving? what is the design of the wheels of the cart? How big are the wheels? How easily do they move? Are they designed for the surface that I'm using it on? What about the height of the handle? So in this picture, this individual is able to adopt a fairly upright posture. If we've got a low handle and a really tall individual, they're going to be leaning forward. They're going to have that hidden load of, holding the weight of their torso as well. Um, what is the terrain like? So where are we pushing the cart or the dolly? Is it on level ground? Are we trying to move across gravel or something uneven where the wheels don't work really well? Is there a slope or a ramp that we've got to go up? I often go in places where the ramp that's there for accessibility is probably to an old building code and it's way steeper than it should be, and it would be impossible to move lots of carts up and down on, right? So where we're traveling with it has an impact. And then, how far are we moving it? Okay, so there's lots of things around pushing and pulling that can be problematic. Even though we have a control in place, but maybe the control isn't properly designed, or maybe people don't use it, and often people don't use it because of one of the things we've talked about here, whether it's the wheels, the handles, the train they've got to go over, right? So those are all things that we need to consider. If we look at lifting and carrying, there are a number of different guidelines out there, and we'll talk to some of those a little bit at the end, and then more so in a different presentation. But I want you to again think of the difference between force and exertion. So this graphic that you're seeing here, this is coming from this is a graphic I've taken from WorkSafe BC's MSI reduction tool, which originally comes from the Washington State tool. Basically, what you're seeing here is, the closer you are to waist level and the closer you are to the person, the weight that's acceptable is higher, right? As you get further from the body, you get closer or above shoulder level, or you get down to ground level, the starting point that's shown here is less. And that kind of ties into that impact of force versus exertion, right? A whole lot less exertion for us to be lifting something in that box that says 32 and 70, because we're not worrying about lifting the weight of the torso. We're also not extending our hands out in front of us, so we're nice and close. The compressive force on the back or lower, all those kinds of things. So this is showing the impact of the location of the lift. There's another table that would show us the impact of the duration and the frequency on it, and that would potentially reduce that weight even more. Okay, so lifting and carrying, lots of things to think about as well. If we look at gripping and arm force, so pushing and pulling implies that I'm walking and I'm moving with a cart, I'm pushing a cart, or I'm pulling a cart or a dolly. Gripping and arm force are something we see in all kinds of different um, occupations within a municipality. The trades, certainly grasping tools and supplies, load securement, so tightening up an item to have it to make sure that it's safe to be moving it. Our parks folks, or outdoor maintenance, so holding shovels, rakes, tree branches, again, load securement, using power tools, right? Lots of different gripping and arm force requirements. Office workers, obviously we've got, moving files and file boxes, holding our mouse, right? So how easy is it for an employee to grip their mouse if they're gripping something that's much smaller than their hand? It requires a lot more effort. So it needs to be appropriately sized. Looking at transit operators, obviously we saw them as a high incident group. Think of how often, how long, how frequent they're holding a steering wheel and they're gripping and re-gripping, right? Very common. It's the majority of their shift. Peace officers and firefighters were another group or two groups that we saw as having issues. We think of their gripping and arm force, holding equipment, holding controls. For peace officers, it might be, um, you know, uh, apprehending a suspect, maintaining control over a suspect, and some of their tactical stuff. right? Firefighters, again, lots of hand equipment, holding hoses, pulling hoses, driving the vehicle to and from calls. Um, Lots of strenuous work when they're physically involved in a control, opening and closing valves, right? Lots of lots of upper body work and gripping as well. Janitorial staff, so holding cleaning equipment. We see a picture of a mop here. Could be driving one of those devices that helps clean floors where they're physically riding on something, but they're still holding controls, right? So gripping an arm force is another common area that we see, and it could be pinch grip or power grip. So implying holding with thumb and a couple fingers or holding with the whole hand. Either one can be of concern depending on how long we're doing it and what it is that we're gripping, right? So um, for a lot of these things, it's likely the duration of how long we're gripping versus the actual grip force, right? Because so we use the example in the picture we see here. If we're manually mopping, it doesn't necessarily take a whole lot of force to grip the mop, but if we're doing it for 4 hours or 6 hours a day, it might be the length of time that's the greater risk. So with these three previous slides that we've been looking at different types of force concerns. So gripping an arm force, lifting and carrying, um, and then pushing and pulling. There are toolbox talks specific to force and these three areas. So after the presentation is done, Rob will share a link to those, and those are good resources that are available that would be relevant to staff that you have in your municipalities. So when we go to look at evaluation tools, and again, we're not going to go into detail on evaluation today just because we only have 45 minutes and I'm getting towards the end of my time. And I just wanted to really set the stage today that, there are a number of things, and it's not just lifting where force is of concern. So there are a number of different tools that are out there that you can use to evaluate the risk associated with force. I'm showing you a screenshot here of the musculoskeletal injury risk assessment worksheet from WorkSafe BC. Um, Portions of this are certainly in a couple documents from Alberta OH&S, but the full tool is available from WorkSafe BC, and it is based on the Washington State checklists that have been around for quite some time and are certainly still valid. I think, like I said, we'll go through those in detail in another webinar, but here gives you some examples of low, moderate, and high risk associated with pinch grip and with power grip. All right, so that's a summary, and then I'll talk to the resources that are available, and then we'll open it up for questions because I'm pretty close to my time here. First thing to highlight is that force represents 47%, which is the highest percentage risk factor to all claims for AMHSA members. So that's the most important thing I think you want to take away from today is almost half of the claims from AMHSA membership are related to force. So that obviously needs to be a focus, and that's why we had today's webinar specifically on this topic. I hope that one of the takeaways you will have from today is that we need to consider the amount of exertion, not just the force required to complete a task. So I guess simplest way to think about that is, just because something is only 10 pounds of weight, let's consider how much exertion is associated with that based on the location, the frequency, and all those sorts of things. So don't get hung up on just the weight of an item. There are other things that could be making it, could require the individual who's moving that or doing something with it to exert a greater amount of effort. JDAs and PDAs are a good spot for starting to identify required forces that could be of concern. But as I said, even if you don't have those in place, if you ask your employees, what do you find the hardest to do? What takes you the greatest effort? They'll be able to tell you, right? Because they're the ones doing it. And then finally, I want you to remember the hidden load. And that's not just when we're lifting. It could be we're just bending down to look at something. We have that hidden load. We're holding our torso's weight, and that in itself can cause us problems, and result in an increase in exertion. As I said, there are a number of different toolbox talks that are specific to force that are available on the AMHSA site. Rob will share those after the webinar, and I would encourage you to check those out. If you haven't seen those before, they're great kind of one-page items that talk about the risk factor and then how you reduce the risk associated with it. They were developed a number of years ago, and they're definitely still relevant. And then these are some documents that I used to provide some insight in today's presentation, and I will certainly share those for Rob to share as well, the links to those. And with that, we will open things up for questions because I've been talking.